Good afternoon, Mr. Ambassador, and welcome to the Zingvn studio. You are the first guest ever to come to this studio to have a live interview with us today. And before this interview, we have an article on Zing News, and we have a tool where our readers send you questions, and we're going to answer, I hope, all of them today. So thank you for coming with us today.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. Appreciate the invitation and greetings to you and all of your listeners.
Thank you. Let me start with the very first questions, and our reader is very excited because they see a lot of video of you on the internet speaking Vietnamese, and they send a lot of questions about how long does it take for you to become fluent in Vietnamese, and what is your secret to be able to speak so many languages?
Well, first of all, I would not describe myself as fluent, but I did study for about a year back in 2004 before I began my assignment in Hanoi, and so at that time, I don't know. I think it's just I had some excellent teachers, and I was very fortunate to be able to interact with Vietnamese friends at the time, and of course the language. If you don't use it, you lose it, as they say. And so, I've when I was reassigned here recently to serve again, it took some practice. I had to actually go back to school for a couple of months just to reacquaint myself with the language because, to be honest, I had not used it, and so I regretted that. And so I think to your listeners, if they have a language skill, I encourage them to use it because it's a living thing. You have to nurture it always in order to keep able to speak it.
Yeah, so I guess that you have to practice it a lot. Do you discover anything when you learn the language in the place you work in?
Well, I've been fortunate that I've served in and lived in Seoul and in Tokyo and learned those languages as just by working with colleagues who are Japanese and Korean, by interacting with them, going out and having fun with them, and expect and here in Vietnam look forward to being able to do the same. Although one of the challenges is in our embassy in Hanoi, all of our team speaks excellent English, and so I really it's a luxury, and if I'm not careful, I'll get lazy and will never use my Vietnamese. So I have to try hard to keep it up.
So, in your personal life, do you seek the chance to speak Vietnamese, like when you go to the food shop or, uh, to the sport event or something?
Of course, of course. When I was here before, I always sought opportunities to speak on the outside, and this time, to the extent I can, I hope to do the same. I've only been back a month, but looking forward to the months and years ahead where I'll be able to get out and interact with people of Vietnam, hopefully many of your listeners, and they could tell me how I can make my Vietnamese even better.
Yeah, and speaking of living in Vietnam, I'm gonna ask you a very cliche questions. That what is the dish that you love the most in Vietnam? But let's not say phở or bún chả because like
Everybody says that.
everybody say
Okay.
so.
Well, I love Nguồn and Nem a lot.
Oh,
Those
nice.
yeah, and there's such a diverse variety throughout the country of different kinds of rolls, Nem and Nguồn, that um, I really do enjoy that very much.
Yeah, and I think that that dish is also a very famous in your hometown, Los Angeles.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. I was fortunate growing up in Los Angeles. I had a lot of Vietnamese American friends around me and had opportunities to go to dinner at lunch at their homes, and so I was blessed from a young age to have exposure to Vietnam in that way.
Oh, that's very nice. Do you think this is let's say fate that one day you become the ambassador in Vietnam? Do you seek to become the Vietnam ambassador, or were you assigned to this position?
I absolutely sought it. I mean, this is, I think, for many people, it would be considered a dream job to serve here, given how important the relationship between our two countries is and will be in the future. And so, for me, this was something I sought out and feel very fortunate that and lucky that things worked out as they did.
Yeah, you first come to Vietnam, I believe, in Hanoi, right? How do you feel it's different from your hometown, Los Angeles?
A lot of people aren't aware. Los Angeles is quite an old city. It was founded by the Spanish back in 1700s. And so there are parts of LA that feel very old, just like in Hanoi. You can feel the history.
Yes.
And so I definitely noticed that about being in Hanoi. The history is around every corner. And even though, of course, the pace of development there is very rapid, as it is throughout the country, it's really, for me, the weight of history and the intrigue of history is something that makes it very appealing, very special to live there.
Yeah. And you have been to Vietnam for like 15 years, if I recall. And I believe that you have seen so many change in those 15 years. Can you tell me some of the notable change that you see in Vietnam in the last 15 years?
Well, I mean, the obvious changes of even though, I mean, the basics of the city, Hanoi, are the same, a lot of the streets are the same. I mean, what's on top of the streets are very different. A lot of of course, new buildings, new restaurants, cafes. I mean, it's all different and growing. But what hasn't changed is, I mean, just how warm the Vietnamese people are and how warmly my family and I were welcomed. That's one thing that stayed the same.
Yeah. So a lot of my American friends want to stay in Vietnam in their retire life. You imagine yourself, living in Vietnam after your tenure ended.
That's a great question. I think it would be I would find it wonderful to be able to live here, but my wife has a say in that too. So we'll see what happens after I retire.
Yeah, and I really hope that you can enjoy your stay here in
Thank
Vietnam.
you.
A lot of Vietnamese students are looking for a chance to study abroad, especially in the US. And they are wondering, will the US government have any policy, to make study in the US less costly and more affordable for Vietnamese students?
So one of the biggest, I think, regrets of COVID-19 around the world was kind of the freezing of foreign students
Yeah.
traveling from country A to country B.
Yes.
I think one of the great strengths of the United States is being able to attract young people from around the world who want to study at American high schools, university, graduate programs, postdoc programs. And, this really suffered because of the pandemic and the inability of folks to travel. And so I'm hoping now that, well, fingers crossed, I'm hoping that as we're moving out of the pandemic in the United States and around the world, that we'll be able to get back to the kind of numbers we saw before. Vietnam, of course, at 30,000 students in the United States. Frankly, I mean, one of my goals serving here is to try and increase that number even more, not just be satisfied with 30,000, but to bring up the number even further. And so, recognizing that studying in the United States may not be for everybody, but there are programs in the U.S. to encourage young people to study there. I mean, we have at the U.S. Consulate General here in Ho Chi Minh City, and then also the Embassy Hanoi, we have something called Education USA, which helps to connect young people with schools in the U.S. and educate them about opportunities, including financial opportunities. And so I would not, I would absolutely encourage your listeners, if they're interested, don't give up.
A barrier for people, especially for the young people who are seeking a job or growing up, in the U.S. Do you have any advice for those young people who, trying to seeking a study or working opportunity in the U.S.?
Well, I think, and this shouldn't come as a surprise or actually come as much of a challenge for young Vietnamese, but obviously, working on language skills is very important. I know, so many Vietnamese young people speak better English than I do, so that shouldn't be a huge challenge. But of course, language is very important, and I think also just having an open mind about opportunities that might be out there. I think very often young people are very focused on, I want to do this, and it has to be at this school, in this city, and this subject. If that certainly can work out, but if it doesn't, I would not be discouraged because there's a lot of other opportunities, whether it's to study or to even to work. So I would just encourage your listeners just to have an open mind about what potential opportunities are available.
And I believe with the relationship between Vietnam and the US right now, we're going to have a lot of opportunity for the young people. So one reader is asking, what 3 words would you use to describe the Vietnam-US bilateral relationship now?
So future-oriented, wide-ranging, I think
Yes.
is another one, and optimistic. I mean, I think when you look at everything that the U.S. and Vietnam are doing, just the sheer breadth of our cooperative efforts, it ranges, from security cooperation to economic cooperation to health cooperation, energy, climate, science, technology. We're even talking about space, outer space cooperation. I mean, the full range
Yes.
of virtually every human or government endeavor we're doing together with Vietnam. And that's remarkable when you compare it to 10 or 15 years ago.
Yes.
And so that's wide-ranging, future-oriented, of course, because what we do is really aiming for building a better relationship going forward, building an even stronger one, and looking at ways we can connect our people even more, as we talked about earlier, educational exchanges, people-to-people exchanges, and then optimistic. I mean, there's so much that we share in terms of our national interests, our national goals, in
Yes.
terms of our aspirations for our own peoples and our children and grandchildren, that I think the U.S. and Vietnam are natural partners, and this is why I feel very optimistic. I think the sky's the limit when it comes to what our two countries can do together in the future.
Yes, I share your view too. But after the pandemic, and now we have quite a violent international situation. Do you think that any new emerging challenge between Vietnam and US is rising? What can we do to address them?
So I think one thing about countries as they get closer together, interestingly, perhaps ironically, but the closer two countries get, very often the more challenges they end up having to face together, and sometimes even frictions that they have to work out together. I mean, I worked on issues related to Japan and South Korea for many, many years, almost 20 years. Two of our closest allies, I'd say our closest allies in the world. Yet the amount of time we spent dealing with challenges and sometimes frictions and obstacles, it was a lot. Because I think when you get close to someone, there's just a lot of things you got to work out. And so I'm going to predict that as United States and Vietnam get closer and closer, we're going to have more and more things we have to work on together, because that's just the nature of close friendships and partnerships.
Yes. Do you have any specific area of bilateral relation that you want to devote?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, absolutely educational exchanges and people-to-people exchanges. Special representative for climate, John Kerry, was here last week, as you know.
Yes.
And, it's very clear to me that climate cooperation is going to be a very important feature of our two countries' ties. And this is something that I want to devote myself to as well. I think we're talking about the future of our planet. And it seems to me a natural area for cooperation between the U.S. and Vietnam. There's a lot we can do, and there's a lot we can provide, whether it's financial assistance, technical assistance, human resources assistance.
Yes.
And so we're prepared to do that. And John Kerry's visit was just the next step after COP26 in Glasgow, which your Prime Minister made a very bold announcement about Vietnam's commitment. But there's a lot of work to do, and we can't wait 15 years. We have to start now. And so this is something I'd like to work on. And I think also just deepening our economic ties, trade ties, of course, and ensuring American companies are able to do business here in a manner that's fair and a level playing field. And I would love to see more Vietnamese businesses going to the United States, investing in the United States. I think more and more, I hope that we can have great Vietnamese companies present in the U.S. and helping to create good jobs for American workers. And so that's another thing I'd like to focus on as well.
Yeah, and trade and economic is also a area that I read very great interesting in. How can Vietnam and the U.S. do better to have improved our trade relation? What are the main barriers that we would need to tackle now?
Our government counterparts concerns about sort of regulatory environment here, tax environment here, and these are all things that come up when businesses try to do business in other countries, but. We'll always address these issues in a way that's respectful, but also in a way that's very frank. And we will work very closely with our business community to raise concerns that we have. But the goal is ultimately to create an environment here that assists not just American companies and American workers, but also hopefully Vietnamese consumers and Vietnamese companies. And with the ultimate goal, we hope, of raising prosperity in both countries.
Recently, Vietnam eliminated about the 3% U.S. wheat import tariff late last year. Yeah, and in early February, the first shipment of tariff-free of wheat had arrived to Vietnam, carrying about 60,000 tons. What are your thoughts about this?
I think that's great. I'm not an agricultural expert, so 60,000 tons, I don't know what 60,000 tons of wheat is. How many loaves of bread is that? But it sounds like a lot. And I think it's great. I would love I would love for the United States to be a source of food and foodstuffs for Vietnam. I think it would be wonderful for us to even deepen further our cooperation on food security and to make the United States the seller of choice when it comes to not just grains like wheat, but also meats like beef and pork, fruits and vegetables. These are all great American products that I think Vietnamese consumers would love to have on their tables.
And the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, it is very comprehensive, but some said that it lacks a clear direction on this economic policy for the area. We will see more, economic engagement for the U.S. to the Indo-Pacific area. Can we expect a revival of TPP or in some form?
Well, what you can expect to see in the weeks and months ahead is the release of what we call, it's the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is meant to really address the kinds of subjects that aren't necessarily contained in a traditional trade agreement. So the IPEF, as we call it, will, for example, look at things like digital economy. It will look at things like supply chain resilience. It will look at things like climate resilience. And we've been consulting with governments in the region, including yours. We've been consulting with members of the business community to try and make this the most effective and useful framework that we can. Recognizing that U.S. engagement in the region is not just about security, but it's about trade and investment. I mean, the United States private sector has $1 trillion of investment in the Indo-Pacific, $1 trillion. And so people who say like, oh, the U.S. is not engaged economically, that's nonsense. We are very engaged economically. But we as a government recognize that we need to ensure that what we do here is part of a larger strategy of engaging with the region. And so that's what the Indo-Pacific strategy and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework are meant to address.
I see. I think that the U.S. and Vietnam has a very similar approach to the future economic. One of which is the green business. And as you said, at the last special envoy of Mr. John Kerry trip to Vietnam, he said that Vietnam need to move further away from coal energy. And how can Vietnam attract a green finance from the U.S. and other countries?
So this is a great question because as Special Representative Kerry said during his visit last week, there are some of the most well-known, largest American companies, banks. They're all eager to do business in countries that have a track record of using fully green energy. They don't want to come in and invest $1 billion in a factory that's drawing its energy from coal. And so, as Special Representative Kerry explained, he was in contact with banks, with big companies, and they're all very eager to do business in a place like Vietnam, which sits on a wealth of green energy potential, whether it's wind power, onshore wind power, offshore wind power, whether it's solar. I mean, Vietnam's 3,000-kilometer coastline provides so many opportunities for green energy. And so to make that transition from coal to renewables, you're recognizing you can't do it overnight, but that Vietnam is better placed than most countries to be able to do this, especially because Vietnam imports all of its coal. It's not like it has to worry about closing down coal mines and putting people out of work. And so it's an important decision that your government made at Glasgow, and now it's the follow-up, the implementation that is equally important. And this is where not just the U.S., but the international community, the World Bank, and other organizations, we're all eager, we're all ready to help Vietnam make that transition, because it's not just for the sake of Vietnam, but also of the world. And we learned about what's happening in the Mekong Delta right now between rising sea levels, but then decreased water flow, causing increased salination of the river. It's harming farmers and fishermen along the riverbanks, and so this is. I'm sure your listeners who are in this area, it hits them very hard every day, and where they live. I'm not an expert on this, and my education is still evolving. But as far as I know, one of the issues along the river is just the number of dams that are upstream, starting in China and moving down. And so with these dams, which do provide very important hydroelectric power, there's no doubt. But how can is there a way to transfer from hydroelectric power in these dams to something that's greener, whether it's solar or whether it's wind power,
Yes.
to allow the river to flow more strongly, more regularly, to help just sort of clean out the silt and push back on the salt water that's intruding from the ocean.
Yes, I think the two countries have a lot to do together, to
Absolutely.
prevent these disaster. And while we talk about the people-to-people change, one of our reader asking about how do you evaluate the people-to-people tie between both countries, and what could be done more?
We have two great people-to-people resources. One is the number of Vietnamese students pre-COVID who were studying in the United States. At 30,000, Vietnam was the sixth largest country sending students to the U.S. after places like India and China. And for Vietnam to be sixth, I think, is remarkable. That's a really significant achievement. So that's one resource. And another resource for people-to-people ties, of course, is the 2 million plus Vietnamese Americans who reside in the United States and who still have, in some cases, a family here or seek to do business here. But these two, how can I say, just sort of precious resources enable our two countries, I think, to build better sort of bridges and foundations between us to further develop people-to-people ties. But the one thing I think is lacking is, of course, pre-COVID, we had many Americans came to travel to Vietnam. I think 700,000, 750,000 at 20, whenever it was, 19. And hopefully those number of American tourists will go up again. But I would love to see more American young people come here to Vietnam to study, to teach English. And so I can't speak on behalf of the Vietnamese government, but there are, for example, if you look at Japan has a great program called JET to bring over young Americans to teach English in Japan. And it's a great way to build bridges and mutual understanding. And I think if Vietnam were to have a version of that where young Americans could come here, I think you'd have a line a mile long of Americans who'd want to come and participate in that program.
That's really nice to hear. I think education is a bridge where we could cross very easily to close up the relationship between two countries. However, how can our two countries strengthen cooperation in this education field, especially after the pandemic?
It is, and I know that we've got a great program here in Ho Chi Minh City, the Fulbright University of Vietnam, which does great work in providing American-style liberal arts education for young Vietnamese. And I know they have plans to expand, which is very exciting. And I know they have exchange programs with other universities, like I think Dartmouth University perhaps is one. And so I think we need to look for more opportunities like that to build bridges between educational institutions here in Vietnam and in the United States, and allowing young people to go back and forth and take advantage of educational resources in each country.
And so after staying here for 15 years and do a lot of work between two nations, what piece of the U.S. history do you want the Vietnamese people to know more about, and vice versa? What story of Vietnam do you think that the U.S. People need to know more?
Wow, that's a good question. The period sort of after World War II, the popular image in the United States is of people living happily together, and America was prospering, and the middle class was thriving, and on the surface that's all true. But in fact, there were a lot of problems under the surface that people chose not to pay attention to. Problems related to race, problems related to gender, and many others. Problems related to sexual orientation, and people just chose to ignore these. Basically, it was discrimination that a lot of groups were facing, and a lot of this finally came out in the '60s. You saw, civil rights movement. You saw women's rights movement. You saw, other efforts to sort of make America a better place. And this took a lot of courage. A lot of people went out in the streets and protested, and it was very divisive. But in the end, I think our country became stronger because of it. So I think, we are not a perfect country at all, as we've seen just in the last couple of years with the murder of George Floyd. We saw once again that racism and discrimination in our country are not are not complete, are not solved. These are ongoing conversations we have to have. That we have problems. I hope we recognize that we have problems, and I hope that people will continually try to do what we call make a more perfect union, to try and create an America that's better and lives up to our ideals. Because we often fall short, but we try to recognize that we fall short. We're not perfect. What part of Vietnam history I would like Americans to learn?
Maybe not history, maybe just a story, economy,
Well,
success story.
so very often people say that there's a saying, I don't know if Vietnam is a country and not just a war. That I think the image of a lot of Americans they have is about the war between our two countries, when in fact Vietnam has a rich history and a rich culture that goes back more than 1,000 years, 2,000 years. And I wish Americans would know that part of Vietnam, that it's, even though our two countries share a very tragic history, there's so much more to Vietnam's story than just that history between the U.S. and ourselves in that period of time. And I hope that as we move forward, we're going to continue to write a history that's optimistic and forward-looking. And I think we're very capable of doing it.
And as we are talking, it is now confirmed that our Prime Minister Phạm Minh Chính visiting the U.S. And how do you make of this news? What do you think will be the priority of the trip? And again, can you see the perspective of the Vietnam-U.S. relation as a strategic partnership closer?
Well, first of all, I mean, our goal is Vice President Harris said last year, and as we've said in other forums, that our goal is to raise our partnership from a comprehensive one to a strategic one. And we think, I mean, all the signs are there. We think that it's time to do this. We feel that we're at the stage where our two countries are already doing so much together that we're hopeful that somehow we can find the right way to do it over the next year. And certainly, I'm committed to that. And we're very excited that we're going to host the ASEAN summit at the end of the month. As many of you and your listeners may be aware, this was originally planned for the spring of 2020.
20, yeah, I think 2020.
And so it's been a long time coming, 2 years. But the fact that we've been trying, we continue to try to do it, is a reflection of really the importance the U.S. places on ASEAN and the centrality of ASEAN in the Indo-Pacific. And so we're very excited your Prime Minister is going. And I think we're still trying to nail down some details about the program, but it's going to be a very exciting opportunity for your Prime Minister and to visit the U.S. and it'll be, I think, very meaningful in the history of high-level diplomacy between our two countries.
One of the things that the Vietnamese people want to know the most is the approach of the U.S. defense and security in Vietnam. And here we have a question that according to the Indo-Pacific strategy, the Biden administration is going to expand the U.S. Coast Guard presence and cooperation in Southeast Asia, and with a focus of advising, training, deployment, and capacity building. So could you give us more info about this? Will be any more transfer of Coast Guard cutter from the U.S. to Vietnam?
Well, in terms of this very specific transfer of cutters, I don't have anything I can announce today, but I think just in more general terms, the broader cooperation that we're pursuing between our country and yours, in the case of the Coast Guard and the Vietnamese Coast Guard and Navy is we strongly believe that Vietnam should have the ability to protect its sovereignty, to be able to defend its independence. We strongly believe that Vietnam needs to be able to patrol effectively its own waters in order to promote its own prosperity. And so this is a message that we hope to transmit when we do pursue these cooperative efforts. It's all about our commitment to a Vietnam that's independent, prosperous, sovereign, in control of its own resources. And so we'll continue to do this because, it's the right thing to do, first of all, and because, we feel this is a really good area for deepening even further our cooperation.
Yes. Some said that given the current global environment, Vietnam